Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at Burkina Faso, specifically trying to get a clearer picture of what's going on under interim President Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
Right. It's a really dynamic situation over there.
We've gathered quite a range of sources, news reports from places like AP, France 24, Reuters, TSS, analyses from Africa Confidential, groups like Human Rights Watch, even outlets like Press TV and The Guardian.
A good mix. And the idea is to try and pull out the key threads, make sense of a very complex and fast-moving story.
Exactly, because the backdrop is pretty dramatic, isn't it? Political instability, huge security challenges, shifting alliances.
Absolutely. We'll be touching on things like reported coup attempts, international reactions, both criticism and support, new alliances, especially with Mali and Niger, economic moves, and crucially, human rights concerns.
And the role of Russia, that seems increasingly significant too.
Definitely. So yeah, the mission today is really to understand the forces shaping Burkina Faso right now under Traoré.
Okay, so let's dive right in. That reported coup attempt in April 2025. The government claimed it was foiled, and they actually pointed towards Ivory Coast.
Which is a significant accusation to make against a neighbor. And the reaction inside Burkina Faso was quite telling, wasn't it?
Yeah, large crowds came out in Ouagadougou sporting Traoré, and the reports highlighted this strong anti-Western feeling, coupled with pro-Russian chants.
It's interesting how that external accusation, whether accurate or not, seemed to actually galvanize some domestic support. It feeds into that narrative of resisting outside interference.
A rallying effect.
Sort of.
Yeah.
But, Africa Confidential also reported arrests within the military around that time. Commandant Frederic Ouedraogo.
He was heading the investigation into a previous coup attempt.
Exactly. And Captain Alizé Tazembedo leading a key force up north. So it suggests the government itself is aware of internal fault lines. It's not just about external threats.
Right. And speaking of external factors, that intervention by U.S. General Michael Langley accusing the junta of misusing gold reserves.
Yes, and that's fascinating because according to the reports we have, that criticism didn't really land negatively for Traoré domestically.
It backfired.
In a way. It seems it was framed, or at least perceived, as more outside meddling, which actually boosted his standing among supporters as someone standing up to external pressure.
So criticism can sometimes strengthen the very people it targets in these contexts.
It can, especially when it taps into historical grievances about colonialism or, neocolonialism. And you see this reflected in the support Traoré gets beyond Burkina Faso's borders.
Yeah, those demonstrations in other African countries and in the diaspora, the Rastafarian rally in Montego Bay, Jamaica was particularly striking.
It really was. They explicitly framed Traoré as a symbol against, quote, white colonizers and neocolonial influence. Priest Wesley Kelly's comments about liberating Africa and wanting Jamaican leaders to emulate Traoré. It shows how this resonates on a Pan-African level.
A powerful narrative of resistance and sovereignty.
Definitely tapping into that deep current of Pan-Africanism.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to governance and policy under Traoré. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel, states the AES, with Mali and Niger. That seems like a major strategic realignment.
It absolutely is. It's positioned explicitly as an anti-Western bloc, a move by these three countries, all under military leadership and facing similar challenges, to coordinate more closely.
And seeking closer ties with Russia is a key part of that.
That seems to be the core driver, yes. A deliberate move away from traditional Western security partners like France and towards Russia for support and, partnership.
And economically, we're seeing moves like nationalization efforts, building the country's first gold refinery.
Right, and suspending small-scale gold export permits. The stated goal is tackling illicit trade.
What's the thinking behind that, do you think? Control? Revenue?
Likely both.
Oh.
It suggests a drive to get a firmer grip on the country's key resource gold, keep more of the value chain and the revenue within Burkina Faso, and reduce smuggling, which potentially funds opposing groups. It fits that broader theme of national sovereignty.
And then there are the symbolic moves, like the mausoleum for Thomas Sankara, Francis Carré designing it. Sankara is such a huge figure.
Hugely important. Still revered across much of Africa for his revolutionary ideas, his focus on self-reliance, Pan-Africanism. Building this mausoleum is a very deliberate act by Traoré's government.
Linking themselves to his legacy.
Absolutely. It's about tapping into that powerful symbolism, positioning themselves as the inheritors of Sankara's project, boosting their legitimacy both at home and perhaps across the continent.
Okay, so we have this image being projected resistance, sovereignty connecting to Sankara, but we absolutely have to address the darker side, the serious criticisms. Human Rights Watch, for instance, raising alarms about the Salenzo massacre in March 2025.
Yes, deeply concerning reports. At least 58 Fulani civilians allegedly killed by pro-government forces and these allied militias, the
The
VDPs.
Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland.
Right. And Africa Confidential even mentioned a video emerging afterwards. It paints a very grim picture. It raises huge questions about accountability and the protection of civilians caught in the middle.
And it's not just alleged violence. There's the crackdown on the media, too. Journalists arrested. The Journalists Association dissolved back in March 2025.
Which is always a worrying sign, isn't it? Actions like that are widely seen as attempts to control information, to silence criticism.
Makes it harder to know what's really happening.
Exactly. A free press is crucial, especially in volatile situations, for holding power accountable. Suppressing it allows the official narrative to dominate, potentially masking abuses.
Another major point of friction is the transition timeline. It was supposed to lead to elections by July 2024, but now it's been extended by 5 years.
A very significant extension. The government says it's necessary because of the security situation, need to stabilize things first.
Which is an argument often heard in these situations.
It is. But for those pushing for a return to democracy, a 5-year delay raises serious questions about the commitment to that process, about where the country is ultimately heading politically.
And that security situation they cite, it remains incredibly challenging. The jihadist groups Ansarul Islam under Jafar Dicko, ISGS.
They're still very active. And Africa Confidential notes their expansion into neighboring countries, too. It's not contained within Burkina Faso's borders.
And Dicko's description of jihadists as patriotic opponents, that's quite a framing.
It's a propaganda move, trying to legitimize their insurgency, perhaps win recruits. He also made accusations against the VDP militias and concerning the Peel ethnic group.
Which taps into those existing ethnic tensions you mentioned.
Precisely. It complicates everything. And you have neighbors like Benin, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire apparently complaining that Burkina Faso isn't securing the shared borders effectively against these groups. The instability is clearly regional.
And despite pouring resources into the Fight That Patriotic Support Fund, big recruitment drives for the Army and the VDP, doubts remain about effectiveness.
Yeah, the security gains seem limited, or at least not decisive. Military action alone rarely solves insurgencies rooted in complex issues like poverty, governance deficits, ethnic grievances.
The VDP themselves seem to be part of the problem in some areas.
Well, there are serious concerns. Their ethnic composition largely Mossi, and the persistent allegations of abuses, especially against the Pule community, are deeply divisive. It risks fueling the very insurgency it's meant to fight. Africa Confidential also noted Ansarul Islam seems well supplied, possibly funding themselves through control of artisanal gold mines.
Which brings us back to gold. It seems central to everything.
It often is in these conflicts. Resource control is key.
We're also hearing about internal divisions potentially weakening Traoré's base, purges in the army, suppressing political opposition, civil society critics.
That points to a narrowing of the regime's support base. The reports about intimidating or exiling leaders from Pule civil society movements are particularly worrying.
And falling out with some Kagwayogo leaders like Musa Thiambiano, Django, those are the traditional self-defense groups, right?
Yes, originally seen as grassroots supporters. If those relationships are fraying, it suggests eroding support, even among groups that initially welcomed the change in power.
Perhaps the most stark indicator is that Traoré's government reportedly controls less than a third of the country's territory.
That's a critical point. Many towns are isolated, cut off by militants, reliant on airlifts or dangerous convoys.
Conditions must be terrible for ordinary people. Disruptions to farming, transport, food shortages. Djibo is often mentioned as being in a dire state.
Absolutely. It undermines the state's basic functions and legitimacy. When people can't farm, can't travel safely, can't get food, it creates desperation. And NGOs trying to help are reportedly facing pressure too.
Meanwhile, the jihadist groups, like Ansarul Islam, are apparently managing to get supplies.
Which suggests they have established control and networks in the areas they dominate, possibly including those gold mines we talked about.
Let's talk more about the international dimension, specifically Russia's role. We hear about Russian paramilitary groups like the Bear Brigade, although Africa Confidential suggested they left, but Russian bodyguards remain, training local forces anyway.
The exact nature and scale of the Russian presence is often murky, but the direction of travel is clear. A shift away from Western security partnerships towards Russian support, whether it's formal military advisors, trainers, or paramilitary outfits.
It's a significant geopolitical shift for the region.
Huge. It changes the dynamics, the equipment, the training doctrines, everything. And it's reinforced by Burkina Faso leaving ECOWAS
The West African bloc.
and the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. These aren't small gestures. They signal a decisive break with previous frameworks.
A deliberate distancing.
Exactly. Cementing this new alignment with Mali and Niger and looking towards Russia as the key external backer.
Alongside this, there's the whole information aspect, propaganda, controlling the narrative.
Very important for the regime. Reports mention efforts to downplay jihadist gains, push pro-government messages, apparently using Russia-linked troll armies. The Prime Minister, Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo, seems central to the PR effort.
And these efforts extend beyond Burkina Faso. Propaganda operations in Côte d'Ivoire, even the U.S.
Yes, using social media, YouTube, maybe even AI, trying to influence perceptions abroad, particularly within the diaspora and potentially to counter neighboring governments' narratives. It's quite sophisticated.
So, despite all these heavy criticisms, human rights, shrinking territory, media suppression, Traoré still holds significant appeal for some Burkinabe and Pan-Africanists.
He does. That image of the young captain standing up to the West, invoking Sankara, wearing the fatigues and red beret, it resonates. The revolutionary chic appearance, as some call it.
But the contrast with the reality on the ground is stark, isn't it? The security crisis, the repression. Africa Confidential points to figures like Oumar Yobre, LT Abdelaziz Pakmagda, the Korag advisory team, as being behind a more hardline, perhaps isolated approach.
There's a definite tension there. The Sankara comparison is powerful rhetoric, but critics argue the substance is missing, that Sankara championed popular participation, whereas the current regime seems increasingly reliant on a small circle and repressive measures.
And the regime itself seems quite fragile given the number of reported threats against it since Traoré took power in September 2022.
Quite a list. A coup attempt alleged in September 2023 involving senior officers.
Then the assassination attempt in January 2025, explosives at the residence supposedly linked to former President Damiba's uncle.
And that rocket attack on the presidential palace in June 2024. Maybe an attempted rebellion, followed by the reported arrival of Wagner personnel.
It really highlights the constant instability and internal threats he faces.
Absolutely. It suggests opposition from various quarters, remnants of the old guard, factions within the current military structure. The need for external security like Wagner potentially underscores that internal vulnerability.
And internationally, beyond the Pan-African support, the reactions have been varied. The AU and UN expressed alarm after that January 2025 attempt, calling for calm.
Standard diplomatic responses, urging stability. The U.S. condemned the initial 2022 coup, calling for constitutional order.
While Russia has been supportive, Prigozhin praised Traoré after the 2022 coup and then the Wagner deployment.
Clear signals of support. And regionally, the formation of the AES itself is a reaction to the tensions, especially with ECOWAS imposing sanctions earlier. It's all interconnected.
So, wrapping this deep dive up, Burkina Faso under Captain Traoré. It's incredibly complex. You've got these internal power struggles, a worsening security crisis spilling across borders, serious human rights issues.
And at the same time, this major pivot in foreign policy towards Russia, away from the West. Plus, this dual perception of Traoré Pan-African hero to some, authoritarian leader to others.
The contrast is really striking, isn't it? The narrative of sovereignty and resistance versus the reports of repression and, frankly, a state struggling to control its own territory and protect its people.
It leaves you with this fundamental tension. How does a leader or a country balance that desire for sovereignty and breaking from perceived neocolonial ties with the urgent needs for security, stability, and respecting fundamental human rights?
That's really the core question to ponder, isn't it? Thinking about how these internal pressures and external forces collide, what it means for the future of Burkina Faso, for the Sahel, and for wider international relations.
And it pushes you to think about that challenge. Navigating those strong anti-colonial feelings, which are historically understandable, while also building effective, rights-respecting governance. It's not an easy path.
Definitely not. Plenty to keep watching there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.